Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'd also like to extend my thanks to my good friend Wolfgang Danschbeck-Gruber for the invitation. I also am happy to count it as a note of personal pride that I first met Prince Hans Adam in 1989 in Vaduz. And you would think, after knowing Wolfgang for 22 years and having gone to many of these conferences, that I would know when to wear a suit and when to wear tweed. But unfortunately, I'm afraid I'm a slow learner. And so with this deficit, I'll have to plunge into my remarks. Remarks in some ways prompted by reflection on the years of my association with this project. The Institute was founded in part over concern about the potential for state-shattering manifestations of self-determination, which in the 1990s generated wars in the Balkans and elsewhere, costing tens of thousands of lives. I see the Institute as motivated by both a positive interest in understanding the conditions for peaceful self-determination and also a normative commitment to reconciling the virtue or the norm of self-determination with the norm of the peaceful resolution of disputes. This concern of the founders of this institute was prescient, and indeed, as has been mentioned already on this panel, reflected a fundamental underlying force in international politics. The bottom line is, unfortunately, that most secessionist conflicts do not become full-scale wars, but the overwhelming majority of them do experience violence. By the calculations of my Dartmouth colleague, Professor Bridget Coggins, of the 275 most recent cases of secessionism, 195 of them had incidents of mortal violence. In total, secessionist conflicts in the post-World War II period killed more than 5 million combatants. And of course, displaced and killed far many more non-combatants. The conflict between the Sudanese government alone and the secessionists in the South have caused approximately 250,000 battle deaths and over 1 million civilian casualties. So there is no question that the founding of this institute connected to an issue of extraordinary importance. And these reflections, looking back on this 20 years, prompt me, of course it's 10 years since the formal founding of the Institute, but 20 years since the initial conversations and meetings got going that ultimately resulted in its founding. These reflections prompt me to ask about the underlying long-term forces that govern the politics of self-determination today. And I think these comments in some ways I'm going to try to bring together what's been said on this panel, so far, and move towards the conversation that we're about to have with our commentators and then the Q&A. The question I'm asking is the underlying potential for the continuance of violence in secessionist movements, violent realization of self-determination claims, are these underlying forces stable, or are they likely to change? And if change, in what direction? Are they going to change toward perhaps ameliorating the problem or making the problem worse? I see 4 fundamental forces at work here. You could list more, but 4 stand out to me. First is sovereignty is a huge prize. Sovereignty is a massive, massive prize. Elites who associate themselves with groups will want this prize, even if the potential for success, the probability of success, is low. It obviously has huge psychological rewards in recognition of groups. Less recognized is the fact that it has huge material rewards for the elites who achieve it in an immediate upgrade in their lives and their prospects. Lucre, money, rents. You can indeed buy and sell sovereignty. There are powers out there that will purchase your sovereign rights. And I can give you some humorous examples of that, but I will hold off on that in the interest of time. You get huge legal rewards. It allows you to be a subject of international law. Sovereignty allows you to commit crimes in the name of the state. It allows for sovereign immunity from most prosecutions. The chance that you will be held accountable for war crimes committed on the path to sovereignty is low and will remain low no matter what happens with the International Criminal Court. And it has low costs. Unlike the old days, sovereignty today is easy because conquest is hard, because insurgency is easy. Once you obtain sovereignty, you don't lose it. It is easy to be sovereign today, unlike in a more vicious international system in the past, where weak sovereign entities would be eliminated. Now, it's very easy to maintain sovereignty. And finally, it is wonderfully flexible. As Stephen Krasner has argued, there's no legislature setting authoritative rules for how sovereignty should be enacted. No court or umpire settles the competing claims. Any kind of deal is possible. And the reason particular sovereign arrangements succeed or fail is not whether they conform to some conventional pattern, but whether they align with the interests of important domestic and international players. Sovereignty, as Krasner says, is whatever the relevant actors say it is, which means you can gain sovereignty, gain all the benefits that I just mentioned, but you can outsource to others your economy, your currency, your foreign policy, and your defense, and you're still considered sovereign. In the old days, that would have been called a colony or a suzerain possession. Today, it's a sovereign state. So sovereignty both has massive, massive benefits, but low cost and great flexibility. So needless to say, it will be desired. The second key underlying reality is that governments will have multiple and overlapping reasons for opposing sovereignty claims. Obviously, and for well-understood reasons, governments tend to view the state as an indivisible thing. It's indivisible, and therefore they're reluctant to enter into negotiations on that issue. They're reluctant to bargain. Secessionism, in practical terms, can have disastrous consequences for host states. You can lose territory, you can lose revenue, you can lose strategic access to important points. And even if the actual territory that is seeking secession is not really very valuable to a state, even if the state is actually losing by holding on to this territory, as has already been mentioned, the government is worried that other groups within its territory may also seek secession, and therefore faces a powerful incentive to be a tough bargainer, reluctant to make concessions. We saw this in conflict after conflict, where the secessionist movement first makes very reasonable demands. Even this was the case, for example, in Chechnya. The original demands were moderate, but a cycle of tough government response by the secessionists, and a ramping up keeps occurring because governments are very, very worried about the reputational consequences of making concessions. So governments will be reluctant to bargain and therefore will fight hard to maintain their integrity. Third underlying reality is that violence capacity, the capacity to pursue your self-determination claim violently, this capacity is readily available to any group interested in making this choice. Not only can the group obtain the weaponry needed to pursue the violent path, they have available to them asymmetric strategies of warfare that can assist in taking on even very powerful governments. No one yet has calculated the casualty rates among secessionist insurgent movements or the fatality rates of leaders. I'm guessing, however, that actually it is not that dangerous. That is to say, the casualty rates among the perpetrators are probably lower than the casualty rates in conventional armies in major wars of the past. Therefore, the costs of undertaking the violent path, although they seem dramatic, may well be lower than you think. Finally, and fourth, is the key issue that has already been discussed multiple times at this panel by people far more knowledgeable than I, and that is that sovereignty is not determined by law, but by the convenience of great powers. Despite a great deal of discussion, little has changed in the UN's approach to secessionism over the last 60 years. The UN has consistently maintained that the right to self-determination does not imply a right to secession. International law and the practice of states has each reaffirmed this. However, the absence of a right to secession does not elucidate the conditions under which secession might be deemed acceptable or justified. What determines states, what determines who gets to be in this club, is recognition by other states. And what determines recognition by other states is not rules, is not law, is no convention. It is convenience and narrow national self-interest. This has been vividly displayed time and time again in recent events, not least the fact that the United States recognized Kosovo. The Russians refused to recognize this, and then the Russians used the Kosovo precedent to recognize Abkhazia and Ossetia. When great powers behave like this, you cannot expect any kind of coherence in the international rules or international practice of recognition. There is now, indeed, I think, less consensus, owing in part to the, I would regard it as irresponsible behavior of certain great powers, notably the United States and Russia. There is less consensus now over criteria for admission in the community of states than there was in the middle of the last century. There was a period of decolonization where secessionist movements were directed against empires, when some very, very powerful states, including the United States and the Soviet Union, actually began to come to a kind of normative consensus that these former colonies had the right to secede and what the conditions were. And they used their power to pressure the imperial powers. And the result was, if you look statistically at secession in that era, it actually, although we know it was a violent process in many cases, it actually proceeded more efficiently, more rapidly, and less violently than more recent cases. The result is there's the possibility out there that if the international community, so-called, by which I really mean the great powers, can agree upon a set of rules, and by the way, all rules are arbitrary. That's what makes law powerful. It's its very arbitrariness. Law should be simpler than the real morality at stake. Law must be simpler for it to matter. If the great powers could reach a consensus on secession criteria and recognition into the community of states, there is some reason to believe on this historical precedent that we could reduce the amount of violence associated with this realization of self-determination principles. However, the prospects for such a consensus emerging look to me to be dim, if not as dim, in practice even dimmer than before. I see very little willingness on the part of the major powers to subject the interest of the moment, their concerns of the moment, to a longer-term strategic interest in settling upon a more coherent set of criteria. Indeed, I think a strategic decision has been made, either by default or consciously, in at least two capitals, Washington and Moscow, which have concluded that ambiguity, a lack of rules, is in their strategic interest, that power should rule, not law. And if that remains the case, then I'm afraid the future of the problem of self-determination will look very much like the recent past. Thanks very much.